Thank you all for joining us in another episode of our podcast, Moving to Value Unscripted. The Moving to Value Alliance is a 501c3 corporation with nearly 1,000 followers in more than 40 states. The MTVA is a grassroots community whose primary mission is to support a value-based healthcare ecosystem with the highest quality outcomes at a reasonable cost for plan sponsors and their members, beneficiaries, or employees. My name is Dr. John Rodas. I'm the president of the Moving to Value Alliance and the president of Arista Health, LLC. We're joined today by our fellow board members, Dr. Stephen Schutzer, president and founder of Upswing Health, and also a founder of the MTVA, and Lisa Trumbull, CEO of SOAN, which is Southern New England Healthcare Organization, a physician-owned and led clinically integrated network in Connecticut and Massachusetts. And we're grateful for SOAN's continued partnership as a sponsor of the Moving to Value Alliance. Our special guest today is Paul Holmes, an attorney with Williams, Barber, Morrell, who's an expert on ERISA law in general and PBM contracts in particular. So Paul, welcome. Thank you for joining us on MTVA Unscripted.
Thanks for having me.
So Paul, maybe let me just start. And I can't imagine you went to law school thinking that, boy, I really want to be a ERISA attorney with specialty in PBM. So would you mind sharing with our audience kind of how you got here today?
Yeah, no, you're right. I did not plan that. I can't even remember how I got into ERISA, but somehow I did. And I've been in ERISA my whole career. I won't tell you how many years that is, but I was introduced to the PBM industry back in the 2000s, doing some work, and then I sort of fell away from it, and then I picked it back up in about 2017. And so for the last, whatever that is, 7 years, I've spent 95% of my time on helping plan sponsors review, negotiate, audit, and so forth. Excuse me, PBM contracts, which has become sort of a specialty in and of itself.
Yeah, and so just for our audience, because I know we're obviously well entrenched in this stuff, but I think it's a challenging space, the whole PBM world and pharmacy benefits and the flow of cash from between pharmacies and wholesalers and patients and health plans. So would you mind just giving us a brief, just kind of and I'm old enough to remember when PBM started, and if I remember right, the idea was, oh, we'll use our scale, our network to negotiate lower reimbursement rates with pharmacies and discounts with drug manufacturers, and we're going to pass these savings back to plan sponsors and patients ultimately, right? Seemed like that was the original plan. So could you kind of explain to us a little bit about how the hell we got here today? Because it doesn't sound like that's what's happening.
No, I mean, yeah, I think PBMs may have started in maybe the late 1980s or in the 1990s. They didn't get real big until the 2000s and beyond. And you're right. Originally, they were just claims processors. They set up electronic connections with all the pharmacies across the country and developed the software to do that. All of the large health insurers and medical TPAs did not have those connections. So it sort of sprang out of necessity. And in the beginning, they were essentially just TPAs for pharmacy claims. But as they grew and as some of them became parts of public companies with profit targets to hit, they became more and more aggressive. And now today they're a little bit out of control.
Can I ask you a question about ERISA? Going back, it's 50 years old, and I took a little look at the original legislation, and it establishes the duty of prudence for fiduciaries. What was wrong with the original language in ERISA that you needed the PPA, now the CAA, to put teeth in it? What was missing? The intent was there 50 years ago.
Well, I think when ERISA was first enacted in 1974, it was aimed at pension plans, and soon, 401k plans, which followed. And it was trying to inject protections of employees, requiring employers to fund the pension promises they made, because it was easy for a company to say, yeah, work for us, and when you retire, don't worry, you'll get a pension, because that was a future obligation that they didn't have to worry about presently. I think it was Studebaker was the famous case where they failed to fund the pensions, and when they became due, they didn't have the money to pay them. So that's what ERISA was formed for. When it was drafted, it included what we call welfare plans, which is non-retirement health plans, but it really wasn't. The fiduciary rules weren't really focused on health plans, which were much simpler back then. So we're playing catch up in terms of taking ERISA's structure and rules, especially the fiduciary requirements, and trying to apply them to really a completely different industry.
Yeah, Paul, I think it might be helpful to have you just cover for our audience, ERISA and the connection to the Consolidated Appropriations Act and the implications in the PBM space with employers. I think that would be helpful. I think most people find that aspect confusing, and it's becoming really relevant in the healthcare industry for self-funded employers.
Yeah, I mean, ERISA has always applied to welfare plans since 1974. It was never, that's not what it was designed for, and there was very little, regulation or litigation to clarify how the ERISA rules should apply to welfare plans. And the CAA really, it doesn't solve that problem. It puts some very important provisions in. Congress started clarifying rules for welfare plans back, I don't know, this wasn't really my specialty back then, but, COBRA, continuation of health coverage after someone leaves employment, and HIPAA, all the privacy rules, Obamacare. I mean, there's been a series of federal laws that have been passed over the last 20 years that have started to regulate healthcare, but not so much the part of it of, what our plan sponsor is supposed to do in terms of negotiating good prices for doctor bills or hospital bills or pharmacy costs. That really has never been touched. And so I think what CAA is doing in sort of a catch-up fashion is saying, okay, well, we need transparency. Fiduciaries can't really do a good job of monitoring how the money's being spent unless they have access to the claims data. And we have to get rid of these gag clauses in contracts so that they can get that access. And then, Section 202, which is very important, said, we need the brokers and consultants to disclose whether they're receiving any indirect compensation from the large health insurers or the large PBMs, because that would be a conflict of interest and would tend to result in those important advisors not really helping plan sponsors, but helping the institutional players, which is exactly what's happened over the last 20 years.
Yeah, the brokers are getting paid from both sides, of course, right? So they're doing really good on this whole deal.
Are you finding, Paul, I'm sorry,
go ahead,
John. Let me just follow up on that. Are you finding, Paul, that brokers are actually doing that and disclosing the commissions? Because we found in the process of exploring CAA on our own that was the most challenging part, is to try to get the disclosures from the brokers.
Yeah, no, you're right. Actually, in my experience, they're not. All the large brokerage and consulting firms are coming up with evasive responses to those requests. I mean, if a plan sponsor educates itself and understands why those disclosure rules were put into CAA, and they make inquiries, especially if they make good, formal, hard, clear inquiries, the consulting firms are coming back with a variety of what I call evasive or bogus responses. So no, the CAA is not really working yet, but it's really up to the plan sponsors to force their hand on that. And, I'm helping them try to do that. I have had a few cases where plan sponsors have, gone to the mat on it. And when they don't get a full disclosure, or in the PBM side, we actually ask for a disclaimer. We actually ask the consultant to confirm that they get nothing. In the medical side, they get all sorts of streams of revenue, and you're just trying to get a disclosure of all the streams so you can figure out if the total is reasonable. On the pharmacy side, you don't want them to be getting any money from the PBM, because if they are, they're conflicted.
Right.
So, but to answer your question, no, the responses have been evasive and wordsmithed, and unfortunately, a lot of plan sponsors, they don't read those responses carefully, and they don't expect those firms to be playing fast and loose with the language. So that's something that we're working on.
My understanding of these PBM contracts are written in a way that, basically obfuscates pricing. So let me maybe take a step back for a minute, Paul. So now we have the CAA and including Section 202 that talks about the disclosures of brokers, but we have the CAA that now tells employers, hey, you guys are the fiduciaries for your health plan. You've got a responsibility. Really, now it's not just a moral and ethical responsibility that I would have said, but a legal responsibility to manage your plans most effectively. So usually our advice to them all is to start looking under the hood at where are you spending your money? What are you spending your money on? What are you getting for your money? And once they do that, they'll find pretty quickly that 30%, maybe more of their total spend is on drugs. And then once they look under the next layer of that onion, they find out that a handful, maybe two handfuls of drugs account for a tremendous amount of the total spend, right? So, and the relationships employers, plan sponsors have with their brokers is usually my experience, many years of these relationships. They're buddies, they play golf together, they have all, it's not though easy to just get rid of them. So what's your advice to an employer now today to say, okay, guys, you have to manage your plan better. You need to look under the hood. Tell me how you fit in with that equation, and what employers need to do at a minimum, to avoid, now the litigation that's starting to happen by their own employees.
Yeah, it's sort of a double whammy effect over the last 20 years. I think, the first part of the problem is that these institutional players, the large health insurers and the large PBMs have just gotten, completely profit driven to a fault. And so they have no shame. They're very large, and they build into their contracts all sorts of profit centers and all sorts of, carefully crafted language that the average person reading it is not going to know what it means. And what it really means is it's different ways for them to make extra money. And they're all taking spreads. They're all buying low. They're doing the part where they say, hey, we've got volume purchasing power, and we're going to negotiate discounts with hospitals and medical practices and pharmacies. That they're doing. It's just they're pocketing all those discounts. So that's problem number one. And employers need to realize that they can't just trust those vendors. They've got to really monitor them because of that. And then problem number two is the brokers and the consultants are all being paid by the institutional players. And they're essentially being paid to stay quiet and to not disclose all of those different profit-taking techniques. So a lot of employers know about problem one, but they rely on their consultants to solve problem one, and their consultants are not going to do it because they're making they make way more money on the revenue streams they get from the PBMs and the health insurers than they do from consulting fees. So, not all of the consultants and advisors are crooks or bad people. Some of them are they're working for big companies and they're doing, what they're trained to do. And they're just not trained to be advocates for plan sponsors. They're sort of trained to, bring business to these big players, generate commissions and other revenue streams, keep the clients happy, answer their questions when they ask about some, routine question, but not to become advocates and to challenge these institutions on their pricing and the different techniques. So really, it's a big problem. It's why it's gotten as bad as it's gotten. Is there's no one who's become you tell me, have you heard of any large consulting firm doing ads on TV or anywhere else saying, hey, you should hire us. We're the independent guys. We're the guys who don't take any money from any of these institutions. We're the ones that are going to take the data and we're going to dive deep and we're going to challenge them. And if they don't change their ways, we're going to help you sue them. You don't hear anybody talk like that. So, you know, I'm doing it, and I'm not the only one. There are some others. I think it's a sort of a growing minority, but you see the lawsuits now that are coming out against the large health insurers, excuse me, because I think some plaintiffs firms have finally gotten that message through, at least on the medical side. I haven't seen as many lawsuits against the PBMs, but I think they're coming. So that's the problem we're up against. So to answer your question, you know, they need to find someone like me, someone who's going to be independent. There are some independent consultants out there. They're generally smaller boutique firms, and they're honest, you know, people who are not taking any money from a PBM, for example, a pharmacy consultant who say, no, I'm not going to take any money from a PBM. I'm going to be completely independent of them. I'm going to give you a fair price and so forth and so on. It's just they're smaller. And so I'm in the process of doing the same thing, trying to find those folks so that I can introduce them to my clients.
Interesting. Well, just going back to the CAA and the ERISA language, I noticed that when there is a claim, a breach claim, it refers to a breach of ERISA and not to a breach of the CAA. Why? I don't understand that. Isn't it a violation of Consolidated Appropriation Act, or is it an ERISA violation?
Well, the CAA amended ERISA and also some other federal statutes. And so, you know, I mean, technically it's a breach of both. I mean, if the conduct is bad enough, you could say it breached a certain section of CAA, but since CAA amended ERISA, it's also a breach of ERISA. The fiduciary part of it, you know, the plan sponsors, the fiduciaries of large health plans have always had an obligation to vet the vendors that they hire, whether it's a TPA or a consultant or any other vendor that's going to do work for the plan. Fiduciaries have always had an obligation to vet those vendors, but what CAA did is sort of clarified that obligation and focused on the conflict of interest that can exist if they're getting two different streams of compensation. Congress found out about that, I think, in some hearings back in 2014, and the Department of Labor wanted to hone in on that. They realized that was a serious problem, but I think there were political headwinds. I don't know the details, but legislation didn't actually happen until 2020 with CAA. So it took a while, but finally it's out there. And unfortunately now there's not a good enforcement mechanism. We help, you know, when we can get a plan sponsor's attention, we ask them if they made a formal inquiry on compensation disclosures. And sometimes they say, no, they haven't. And in that case, we help them do it. If they have, we ask them what response they got. And usually we find an evasive response and we say, well, this really isn't acceptable. It doesn't really answer the question. So you've got to go back and do it again, because, you know, what CAA says in 202 is that if the consultant or broker is not completely responsive, you're supposed to report them to the Department of Labor. And to protect yourself as a fiduciary, you know, your obligation is to say, hey, we tried to get the disclosure, they wouldn't give it to us. And so you're supposed to report them, but I have not heard of too much activity there.
So it's the direct and indirect compensation in particular, to your point. It's not just
Correct.
yeah, I get paid by you, the health plan sponsor. Oh, but by the way, but I also get 3 times as much from PBMs for, you know, all these preferential, you know, pharmacy.
Usually it's 5 times as much or 10 times as much.
Wow.
At the
Yeah.
end of it.
Yeah. So
Wow.
you wonder who they're working
I
for.
went into the wrong business.
Yeah. Wow. Wow.
And
So,
Oh my God.
so Paul, it sounds like there's a lot of headwinds here, a lot of challenges for employers to try to, you know, it's a conspiracy against them, unfortunately, to figure this all out. And so let's say I'm an employer and I call you and say, hey, listen, I'm just trying to understand, you know, what I got here. Tell me your approach, because it sounds like you may come into it before they even have engaged another broker to look at their plan details to try to start forming a new plan. they just want to start with the beginning and say, hey, we need to start looking at our contracts. And tell me what, how you start.
Yeah, I mean, usually I just sit down with them. I give them some of this information that we just discussed, and then we develop a plan for getting the contracts to me, letting me take a look at them. And usually we do it in sort of stages. And the first stage is just sort of, let me look at it, let me write up a memo, and let's have a meeting and let me walk you through the provisions in these contracts that are not in your favor. And if we, if they want to quantify how much those provisions are costing them, we sometimes need to bring in, a data expert and look at claims data and say, okay, well, because of these prices on these generics, here's how much extra spend we have. So, we need some help in terms of quantifying. I can ballpark it, and usually I'm not too far off, but so it's really first it's an education process, and then it's up to the plan sponsor to decide, okay, wow, we had no idea that's what was happening. Shame on us. It doesn't look like our broker or consultant was really doing what we thought they were doing. Looks like we're probably going to need to replace them. And so then we get into phase 2 about, okay, what do we do next? How do we find an independent consultant? Do we start thinking about changing PBMs? And we go down that path, and you can renegotiate your current contract with the PBM. The large PBMs are not too cooperative when it comes to that. There are a lot of what I call small or mid-sized PBMs that are much more, they're not perfect, but they are much more reasonable in terms of their profit goals, let's say. And you can reduce your spend significantly by going to one of those firms, but you have to fully vet them, because even though a lot of them say they're pass through, we pass through all the costs, we don't mark them up. Some of them say that, but their contracts don't match up. So but that's sort of the start. You have to educate yourself, understand the process, see if your broker and advisor is really not helping you. A lot of times, we don't necessarily recommend that they fire everybody, on the spot. You can't do that, because you're running these plans and you have to keep your employees, covered. But you start the process, and usually when they find a better advisor, that ends up eventually leading toward a change of the PBM and savings and sort of a new procurement and monitoring process where they learn the lesson that unfortunately they can't ignore their healthcare costs.
And you help them with that, we'll call it the new PBM contract. Is that
right? Yeah, I help them bring in the people they need. I sort of, I don't know if I quarterback the process, but I try to help introduce them to people that they pick. They have to interview them and decide who they want to use. And then eventually they get to a point where they have much less wasteful spend. They have a much better understanding of how it works. And, there's a big opportunity right now for people to fill, for consultants and brokers to fill that gap. But so far we're not seeing too many step up.
Yeah. Paul, there was an article published recently in Modern Healthcare about, the disdain in Washington for the level of consolidation that's occurred in the industry, and, vertical and horizontal consolidation. And when we look at the PBM space, we're down to 3 or 4 that are controlling the entire market. And I'm wondering what you're hearing, what you're hearing in Washington about how they would target this consolidation, how they might approach PBMs, and any future changes to CAA to put a little more rigor or penalties into the process.
Yeah, I'm probably not the right person to ask that. I'm not.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm sort of in the weeds, and I'm not. I mean, I keep up with it. I mean, I just saw it today. I got an email that another lawsuit was filed against Aetna by a major company. Obviously, the cases that were filed, or the case that was filed against the fiduciaries of the Johnson and Johnson plan, which was a pharmacy case, was very, we'll see where it goes, and I'm hoping there are more of those. I don't really, I'm not a big fan of the fiduciaries getting blamed for this. But, when push comes to shove, I mean, it's got to start somewhere. I mean, the fiduciaries have to wake up and realize that, it's something that you wouldn't expect. I mean, in American business, you don't expect your major vendors to be profit gouging you, and you don't expect these major consulting firms to be taking their side instead of yours. So I understand that, I have these conversations all the time, and I've had many dozens of large plans basically thank me for my time and say, essentially, we don't believe you. We don't think our longtime consultants would do that to us.
Oh, come on, you're kidding.
Yeah.
Oh, that's brutal. After
Well,
all that.
it's sort of a perfect storm because those firms are very good firms and do great work in a lot of areas. It's just in this healthcare industry where there's this history of commissions. Basically, there's a history of the advisors, the brokers, and the advisors. Essentially, most of their money they're making for introducing the client. I mean, they're mostly getting paid not for how they help the client, but for introducing the client to one of these vendors. The advisors are essentially the sales force, the marketing and sales force of these entities. So, it needs to change to where these advisors are getting paid for their expertise in how to monitor and control healthcare spend.
Paul, this is so, you need a FBI forensic analyst to follow the money in this business. But I've watched for our audience, if they want to learn more about this flow of money, they should watch Eric Bricker's video on PBMs, because I've watched it 3 times now with notes at 0.75 speed to really follow it, because it is the most convoluted thing. And of course, when plans are convoluted like that, it's easy for people to take advantage every step of the way. And that seems to be what's happening. I did have a question, and I know you're not the guy who actually looks at the drugs and what you're spending and where you can spend more. You have people coming in to help you do that. But once they do that, one big red flag is in the specialty pharmacy spend. These drugs are high cost, and guys like me who run hospitals really take advantage of buying those drugs at discount prices through our 340B program, and then jacking up the price and then charging a big fee at our infusion centers. And we've had AJ Larkin on the plans on our unscripted with CapRx, and new people are trying to move into this space. I guess my question is, when you help folks, when you get to that advanced stage of now having a new PBM, what's your advice, and what are the pros and cons maybe of carving out specialty drugs or having stop loss coverage? What do you recommend to your clients, your employers, when it comes? And if that's too granular, it's okay. I understand.
I think I think that's like in the medical side, you might take note that some of the very large employers are now, they're doing direct contracting, for example. They're going straight to big health systems. They're going for surgery bundles. I think, Dr. Schutzer is familiar with that. And, they're direct contracting and with imaging centers, direct contracting with laboratories, direct contracting with, orthopedic groups, direct contracting for maternity care. And so, that's bypassing the big health insurers and basically saying, we're going to take the middlemen out, because we don't mind paying providers for, especially the good ones with very high quality metrics. Employers are not, they want to pay those people. They want to find them and pay them. They just thought that that's what the large health insurers were doing for them. They're now finding out that that's not what they were doing. So the same thing's happening in the PBM space, where, I have several clients now that they're basically trying to find a small PBM that will just process the claims for a fee. And they're bringing in a special clinical group to monitor specialty drugs and to tell them, okay, which of these specialty drugs should we be covering on our formulary? Which ones do we not have to cover? What's a fair price? Where are we going to source them? In other words, it's not a good idea to have the same company that's sourcing them also decide which drugs everybody's going to get for obvious
Right.
reasons. So yeah, that's, so carving out specialties, one, even carving out the prior authorization and step therapy process is something that almost no plan sponsors are thinking about. I
Oh,
mean,
that's a
I'm
great
in a
idea.
battle now with one of the large PBMs where they're letting all those GLP-1 claims through for
Right.
non-diabetics. I mean, those
Yeah.
were, those are diabetic drugs, and obviously they're being prescribed off-label for weight loss. And so employers are having, quadruple, quintuple spend because they have all these non-diabetics taking these expensive drugs, which, I think they do generate weight loss, but as soon as you get off them, that stops and you gain the weight back. So the PBMs are sort of, doing what they can to get as many claims approved and as many dollars coming in the door, and they're not really trying to help the clients, control stuff like that.
Yeah, I could tell you, our business is to manage cost of care for employers, and that one change, we talk about new technology, new drugs, new, options for patients, but that one change has exploded the cost of pharmaceuticals, the pharmaceutical spend, for pretty much every employer that we see. And, one of the questions I had for you, Paul, was, Steve referenced the J&J lawsuit. And I read that and I thought it was laid out pretty simply, pretty easy for everyone to understand. And I'm wondering if you think that that's a good rubric for an employer who wants to become familiar with this space and how it might be impacting, their health plan to at least orient themselves to it by looking at something like that, or whether there's another resource for employers to begin to, read or reference, so they could maybe gauge, their exposure here.
Yeah, the J&J complaint was, I thought, put together, it was well written. And somebody can take that and just read, don't read the legal parts, just read the basically recitation of facts and allegations. And that, that's an eye opener. I mean, when you see that you've got a major PBM that you've hired and a major consulting firm that you've hired, and yet you're paying, $16,000-$17,000 for drugs that should only cost $300. That's really an eye opener. And sadly, that's just one of many profit centers. So, I mean, I was aware of that problem, so I'm glad that case, the overcharges on specialty generics has been a problem now for a little while. And just briefly for anyone listening, the way the PBMs did that is they basically, in the specialty part of their contracts, they said, oh, well, we're going to give you an AWP minus a 20% discount on specialty drugs. And people say, okay, well, 20%, that's a pretty, that's not a bad discount. Okay, we'll do that. But what people didn't realize was that the discount on specialty generics should be AWP minus 80 or 90, not 20. So
yeah, I was astonished at the prices.
I mean, you can easily solve that problem by going back and negotiating and saying, well, we'll take the 20 on brands, but we need an 80% discount on generics, or more. And that's just knowing, if you know contracts and pricing. I mean, that would jump out to somebody like me. Now, I couldn't, that's when I show that to a client, I say, look, you're probably getting killed on specialty generics. And if they say, well, by how much? I can't tell them the exact number. I can only guess. But I can say, well, you're getting a 20% discount instead of 80. Let's look at your generic spend, and you can do a little math. And so that's one that I think eventually will be shut down or reduced because now people are aware of it. But there are a lot of other ones.
Yeah. The conversation speaks to supporting these so-called pass-through PBMs, right? But at the same time, also supporting the independent pharmacy industry. Because as you know, many of the PBMs own the supply chain, and the traditional supply chain is hard to break into. So we need to support the independent pharmacies of our country. But going back to the J&J, Paul, I think about the three categories of breach claims. One, the Department of Labor can bring a claim. Many of them have been employer versus TPA or payer for breaches, but the J&J may be the only one, at least the one I'm aware of, where it's an employee versus employer. So, and those of us who've been interested in the value agenda, so forth for years, have a lot of hope in this. So I read that too. And like John and Lisa, until I read those first 30 pages, I didn't realize how egregious it was. Right. I listened to Eric Bricker. I looked at it and I got a migraine, but this was written at almost a kindergarten level. Like, how can you argue that this is malfeasance, right? But I've heard some ERISA experts say not so fast. It's not a slam dunk the way you would think it would be. And the reason is because it's a business norm. That's what the defense is going to claim. This is just the way it looks bad, but this is the way. How do you break that cycle? This is a business norm. I mean, it's ludicrous.
Well, I'll tell you what my answer is that I mean, and I agree with them. This is not a slam dunk case. I mean, because what the PBMs are going to, I think what they're going to say is, well, you signed the contract. And okay, that's their first thing they're going to say. And this pricing, the pricing complies with the contract because we promised you a 20% overall discount, and we're meeting that, even though even though it allows us to gouge you on specialty generics, we're meeting what we promised. So the next step is, well, maybe you need to sue your advisor. Maybe you need to sue your advisor who you paid good money to help you negotiate the contract. Where were they?
Yeah, everybody's going to point the finger at everybody else, right?
Well, obviously the PBMs are going to defend themselves, but I don't know that the advisor has much of a defense. What are they going to say? They didn't realize that the 20% aggregate discount was unfair. They should have, I think. So that's, so instead of blaming the fiduciaries for not catching this, maybe some advisors need to be sued, and maybe that will wake them up and say, wow, we're in a bad spot now. We were making all this money through this secondary revenue stream, but now people are going to come after us. And I think that's what's going to happen.
That's a very good point.
How that's going to, how that's going to
That's
turn out, I can't tell you.
That's a logical sequence then. So the employees would sue the employer saying, hey, you guys aren't managing my plan the way you're supposed to. And then the employers look at the stuff and say, well, wait a minute, that's the advice we got from our broker. So they would now sue, you're saying, the broker saying, hey, you gave me bad advice, and as a result, we're basically screwing our employees. Right? Is that the
right?
Yeah.
That's why I said that, that I'm hoping that there are more of those cases filed against fiduciaries, even though personally I'm not going to file any, because I don't think they're not really the main perpetrator.
Right.
But they need to wake up and realize, oh, there's a problem here, and we need to get different people helping us to solve the problem. And then, you mentioned CapRx. I'm not, I know who they are, and I know a little bit about what they do, but I haven't worked with them a lot. I hope to work with them more. Some whatever you want to call it, some disruptors need to come into the space and say, hey, if you don't like the way you're being treated by those big PBMs, why don't you look at our contract? And, if you sit down with them and you go through basically what I would do is I'd sit down with CapRx, and I have a long list of things that I don't like about the big PBM contracts. And I'd say, which of these things are you willing to change for me? And if somebody can do that and come into the market, I think there'd be slowly but surely, there'd be, a pretty dramatic movement of plan sponsors to, what you might call an honest PBM.
Right.
What Mark Cuban is trying to do too, right, guys?
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, transparent. Here's our prices. You know, if you like them, sign up.
Yeah, the concern, of course, you have these oligopolies that control the whole market for the most part, right? I mean, so it does kind of bring you back to, U.S. Steel and Standard Oil a little bit, right? You have two or three, basically three, right, in the wholesale space and three in the PBM space. So there's definitely an opportunity now for somebody to come in with the rebar, which happened to U.S. Steel.
Well,
I think
yeah,
it's
I
a
mean,
right market for disruptors, right?
I've had some good brokers come to me and say, look, I didn't really understand all this. I'm really trying to do the best I can do for my clients. I didn't realize the PBMs were doing this. Can you help me? And so I do. I help them. I try to get hired by the client, not by the broker. But there are brokers that want to try to fix this. So there have been quite a few cases now where I've gone in, reviewed the contract, found the problems, explained it to the broker. The broker says, wow, okay, well, let's take the pharmacy away from this health insurer. Let's carve out pharmacy and go find one of these, more transparent PBMs. And as soon as they do that, the health insurer says, well, sorry, we can't let you do that. Or, we're going to charge you a $500,000 fee if you want to carve out the pharmacy, or we're not going to give you the records. Sometimes even plan sponsors that do the right thing and develop a good game plan, they run into other obstacles. It's not always easy.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I know, for example, I know one guy who was with one of the big consulting firms, and he was, knee deep in all this, and he's not the only one who basically broke away and said, you know what, I can't do this anymore. I can't lie to my clients about getting paid from both sides. So he created his own consulting firm. He doesn't take any PBM money. He's a very high integrity guy. And he did that. And then he realized that he could convince clients that they should move away from the big PBMs, but he didn't have anywhere to send them. So he founded his own PBM. And he's got a structure. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but he's basically asked me, he said, here's my standard PBM contract for my new company. Would you look at this and tell me what you would ask me to change? And I did that. And I went through and I said, okay, well, because he used the model from the industry, and I went in and I said, well, this is pretty good, but I would want this tightened, blah, blah, blah. He said, I'll do all of that. So he just wants to get paid for processing claims, which you can make a nice living doing, but nobody will hire him.
Who's that, Paul? What's his name?
His name's Roy Wilkinson. He's got a PBM called
He's
Mutual RX, but he's having trouble getting it off the ground because
What's it called?
Mutual RX. But the point is that the reason he can't get it off the ground is because none of the consultants and brokers will send their clients to him because he doesn't pay any kickbacks. He's got a small mark. He's like a Mark Cuban. Well, not like a Mark Cuban really, but I've had several clients call. I've had a couple new clients call me and say, we just did a comparison of our generic prices to Mark Cuban's, and we can save $4 million moving to Mark Cuban. Can you help us do it?
And he won't get bought. I don't think he's at risk.
I don't think so either. I agree.
Yeah, to that point, I think that's the concern of what we were talking about earlier. I think anybody new coming in, it's kind of like, Scott Conard, we had a Scott Conard, Paul, I don't know if you know Scott, but he ran a physician group that was saving tons of money by keeping people out of the hospitals and emergency departments and sending them to lower cost places, ambulatory surgery centers. The health system in the area bought the group and then shut it down because it was hurting the hospital. And I think that's my concern in this space. I mean, these guys are going to just buy up anybody who's competing and then close them.
Right. Yeah. Somebody's going to have to, whether it's Cap RX or someone, a couple are going to have to come around and actually stick to their guns and do the right thing. And they could become the next Amazon of pharmacy claims processing.
Yeah, I agree, because I think the Standard Oil, analogy is probably not that far off, right? I think, those guys, at some point. I mean, they're still doing pretty good, actually. But you got to break up these big guys. I mean, somehow. And I'm not usually looking for government to solve our problems, but
Well, I think they would eventually have to compete to some degree, you know, if there were alternatives. I mean, if suddenly, you know, CVS or Express Scripts lost a third of their clients, I mean, and they're a public company, so their shareholders wouldn't be happy. You know, they'd have to do something different, but we're so far from that right now, it's hard for me to
See
to
that
think about
happening.
that.
yeah.
I think to be continued.
Yeah, Paul, well, I think we're wrapping up, but I really appreciate your time. It's clearly a space that's rife with opportunities to do better, because it's hard to imagine doing worse, actually. You know, I just feel, you know, regarding our conversation about litigation, employers suing employers, which is never a great space to be in, and then employers suing their advisors. You know, the interesting thing in that whole model is who gets left out of that is the PBMs themselves, who are the big source of the problem. So there's, again, that's where the disruptors hopefully have to come in and change the
Well,
paradigm.
you know, just let me clarify. I mean, in my brain, you sue the PBMs and the consultants, and you sort it out. In other words, certain of the profit taking, you can probably recover from the PBMs because it wasn't approved in the contract. And then anything that was approved in the contract, you blame the consultant for that. Now, I'm not a litigation attorney, and I'm not saying this would be easy, and those are very well-funded defendants. There's plenty of blame to go around, and maybe some of that litigation would help wake people up and spur some change.
Yeah.
Well, at the end of the day, I'll close with just saying that employers have to start getting control over this. And I was at a conference last week, and I said employers have to look at their healthcare spend as a variable cost instead of a fixed cost. And if they look at it as a variable cost, then they start saying, wait a minute, you mean we could control the pricing of what we're paying for stuff? And once you start looking at it that way, you start thinking of it differently. And I think and then they'll look under the hood and they'll see how much you're spending on this drug, and they look at the variability of pricing. And then it becomes pretty transparent that they can do better, just like in any free market. So there is hope, and I'll leave on a positive note. There is hope for improvement. But thank you so much for joining us today, Paul, and thanks to Steve and Lisa for helping us today. And we'll look forward to our next podcast. So thank you, Paul.
Yeah, thanks for
Thanks,
having me.
Paul.
Keep up the good work.